That night, Josie Mercer was driving home from a late shift when she heard the sound a deep, guttural moan coming from an abandoned warehouse at the edge of Dock Ward. Everyone in Boston knew who owned Dock Ward. Anyone who walked in without permission didn't walk out the same. Josie knew that. She pulled over anyway, popped the trunk, grabbed her surgical kit, and stepped into the dark. Inside, a Neapolitan Mastiff, weighing nearly 150 pounds, lay slumped on the cold concrete floor. Its hind leg was clamped in a steel trap, the kind that didn't end up here by accident. The dog snarled at every shadow that moved, but when Josie knelt beside it and placed her hand on its head, it went silent. It looked at her, then lowered its head onto her lap as if it had been waiting for her for a very long time. She didn't know this dog's name was Brick. She didn't know he belonged to Sterling Voss, the real owner of Dock Ward, the man who ran half of Boston from the shadows. And she certainly didn't know that 4 years ago, Sterling lost his wife. And from that day on, this dog hadn't let a single person on earth touch him. Not one, until tonight. And she had no idea that the steel trap clamped around Brick's leg wasn't an accident, but the opening move of a betrayal about to tear the Voss empire apart from the inside. The story begins here. If this story touched you, hit like so more people get to hear it. Share it with someone who needs to believe that healing can still come from the most unexpected places. And subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Josie opened her tool bag with one hand, while her other hand stayed on Brick's head. She pulled out the steel cutters, checked the blades with her thumb, then lowered herself until she was level with the trap. The teeth of the trap had bitten deep into the muscle above the joint of his rear leg, where the tendons and blood vessels lay dangerously close together. If she cut at the wrong angle, the trap would snap back and tear deeper. She needed absolute precision. I know, she whispered to Brick, her voice low and steady, as if she were reading something dull and sorrowful. It hurts badly. I'll do this as fast as I can. I need you to stay still. Can you do that? Brick looked at her. His eyes were brown, cloudy, exhausted, but he didn't move. He lay still, as if he understood every word. Josie had been talking to animals since she was a second-year veterinary student. Her professor had once told her it was a meaningless habit. She didn't agree. A human voice kept an animal's breathing steady, and steady breathing kept the heart rate from spiking, and a heart rate that didn't spike kept the wound from bleeding more. That wasn't spirituality. That was physiology. She set the cutter blade against the left hinge of the trap and found the exact pivot point. She squeezed. The metal screeched. Brick shuddered, but he didn't jerk away. She kept the pressure fixed, slow, even. The first hinge gave way. She moved to the right hinge. Her hand was smeared with the dog's blood, slippery, hard to grip with. She wiped it on her pant leg and tightened her hold on the cutters. The second hinge broke open. The trap opened. Josie gently separated the two iron jaws from Brick's leg. The dog let out one sound, short and faint, then fell silent. Josie quickly examined the wound with the small flashlight from her bag. The tissue was crushed and swollen, but the main tendon hadn't snapped. The pulse still beat beneath the skin. The dog would keep his leg if she handled this properly within the next hour. She was wrapping temporary gauze around the wound when she heard engines outside the warehouse. Not one vehicle. Several. Headlights swept through the gaps in the iron door, laying long streaks of light across the concrete floor. 3 black SUVs stopped outside. Doors opened. Shoes struck gravel. Fast. Many men. Then the warehouse door was shoved open. 4 men stepped inside, their flashlights shining straight into Josie's face. She narrowed her eyes, but she didn't stand. Her hand was still holding the gauze against Brick's leg. Stand up. Step away from the dog. Josie didn't move. She was keeping the gauze in place for temporary pressure. If she let go now, the wound would start bleeding again. I'm holding this dog's leg, she said, her voice neither rising nor falling, flat as a tabletop. Whoever wants to talk can wait until I'm done. The 4 men looked at one another. They weren't used to being refused, especially not by a woman kneeling on a cold concrete floor in the middle of Voss territory at midnight. But they also saw Brick. The dog was lying still beside her. Lying still. The same dog who had broken a man's arm 3 months earlier when the man tried to pat his head. One of the men pulled out his phone. Call the boss. 12 minutes later, a 4th car stopped in front of the warehouse. Not an SUV. A black sedan. Dark windows. Quiet engine. The door opened. A man stepped out. Sterling Voss didn't hurry. He passed the 4 guards standing at the door without looking at them. He entered the warehouse alone. His footsteps were even, neither fast nor slow. The sound of his shoes striking concrete echoing through the empty space. He saw Josie first, the strange woman, hands smeared with blood, hair damp with sweat, kneeling on the freezing floor of his warehouse in the middle of his territory. Then he saw Brick. The dog was breathing evenly, not growling, not baring his teeth. He was lying beside this woman in a posture Sterling had seen only once in his life, with only one person, and that person hadn't been here for 4 years. Sterling stopped. Something shifted behind his eyes. It didn't show on the outside. It didn't become an expression. But it was there. He lifted his right hand, palm facing behind him. The 4 guards backed away from the door without a word. He stepped closer, stopped 3 paces from Josie. He stood 3 paces from Josie, looking down at her, then noting the wound on Brick's leg. His gaze shifted to the trap lying wide open on the concrete floor, lingering there longer than necessary. New hinges, no rust. Teeth sharpened again, brighter than the body of the trap. This wasn't a trap some hunter had forgotten. This was a trap set by someone who knew exactly what he was placing, and exactly where he was placing it. Sterling noted that. He didn't say it aloud. "What do you need?" he asked. Josie didn't look up. She was checking the pulse in Brick's leg again with 2 fingers. A clean place, good light, a solid table. This dog needs minor surgery within the hour if you want him to keep the leg. Sterling didn't ask who she was. He didn't ask how she had entered his territory. He didn't ask why his dog was lying still under the hands of a stranger. He turned toward the warehouse door. 3 orders, 3 short sentences. Bring the car to the back door. Call Mrs. Voss and tell her to prepare the kitchen table. No one touches this woman. The Voss mansion stood at the end of a stone-paved road on the edge of Dock Ward, with gray stone walls and heavy iron gates, the kind of house people could look at from a distance and know they shouldn't come closer. Josie didn't look at the house. She looked at the kitchen table. Thick oak, wide surface, solid legs, strong enough to hold 150 pounds of dog and a field surgery. Good. She washed her hands at the kitchen sink, scrubbing up to her elbows, then dried them with the clean towel Margaret had already placed on the counter. She spread a plastic sheet over the tabletop and laid out her tools in the order she had done hundreds of times before. Small scalpel, hemostats, curved suture needle, absorbable surgical thread, sterilogauza, antiseptic bottle, local anesthetic, the last vial in her bag. Brick was placed on the table. The dog groaned softly when the guards lifted him, but he didn't bite. Sterling signaled for everyone to leave the kitchen. Then he moved around to the head of the table and placed both hands on Brick's head. His large hands held the dog's heavy, folded head, his fingers slightly curved, with just enough force to steady him, not enough to press him down. Then he spoke to him. His voice was low, almost a whisper, with words Josie couldn't hear clearly, and she didn't try to hear them. That conversation wasn't meant for her. But she saw Brick respond. His jaw muscles loosened. His breathing slowed. His ears lowered, not from fear, but from trust. Josie had met many dog owners. She had met people who loved dogs, people who spoiled dogs, people who treated dogs like toys, people who treated dogs like children, but she had never met anyone who spoke to a dog in that voice, the voice of a man who didn't need the dog to understand the words. He only needed the dog to know he was here. She injected the anesthetic around the wounded area, waited 2 minutes for it to take effect. Then she began. 40 minutes. She treated the damaged tissue first, cutting away what needed to be removed, careful and clean. She checked the tendon, checked the blood vessel. The main tendon was intact. She had been right with her assessment back at the warehouse. A small branching vessel had been crushed, so she clamped it and stopped the bleeding. Then she sutured. 14 stitches. Even-handed, evenly spaced. Through all 40 minutes, Sterling didn't move. Both his hands held Brick's head. His voice continued in that steady murmur, and his phone buzzed on the kitchen counter at least 5 times. He didn't look at it. Josie cut the excess thread from the final stitch, checked the full line of sutures, wrapped the bandage, exhaled. Done. Sterling looked at the stitches. Then he looked at Josie. He didn't say thank you. He nodded once, short and quiet. She understood. There were people whose gratitude couldn't hold everything they wanted to say, so they said nothing at all. A silver-haired woman stepped into the kitchen. Josie didn't know how long she had been standing at the door. The woman placed a cup of hot coffee on the counter in front of Josie, without asking if she wanted it, without asking if she took it black or with milk. She set it down, turned away, as if the matter required no discussion. Josie drank. Black coffee, bitter, hot. Her hand trembled faintly around the rim of the cup. A normal reaction. The body always trembled after adrenaline drained away. She was used to it. She finished the cup. Brick lay on the table, breathing evenly, asleep. Sterling still stood beside him, one hand resting on the dog's neck. The silver-haired woman returned to the kitchen, took Josie's coffee cup, washed it, and turned it upside down on the rack. No one said anything. The only sounds in the kitchen were the dog's breathing and the water running in the sink. Josie said she would leave. The dog was stable, the sutures were clean, and she would leave the antiseptic and instructions for changing the bandage. She stood, then began packing her tools back into her bag. Brick opened his eyes. He looked at her as she closed the bag. Then he dragged himself down from the table. 150 pounds. Rear leg freshly stitched. Anesthetic not fully worn off yet. He slid to the edge of the table, touched the floor on 3 legs, held the rear leg suspended, and began to walk. Not after Josie. Toward the stairs. Josie stopped and watched. Sterling stopped and watched. The silver-haired woman stopped and watched. Brick hauled 150 pounds up the stairs, one step at a time, his rear leg not touching the floor, the other 3 legs bearing his entire weight. He didn't groan. He didn't stop. He reached the top of the stairs, turned into the second-floor hallway, went to the door of the guest room Margaret had prepared for Josie, and lay down, across the door, blocking the entire entrance. Margaret looked at the dog, then looked at Josie. "You talk to him." Then she turned and went back down the stairs. Josie stood at the head of the hallway, her tool bag on her shoulder, looking at the 150 pounds dog lying across the door to her room. The dog wasn't hers. The room wasn't hers. This house wasn't hers. But Brick looked at her with unblinking eyes, and she understood that she wasn't going anywhere tonight. She set the bag on the floor, sat down beside Brick, her back against the wall, her legs stretched out. Brick shifted closer, curling around her, his enormous body warm and heavy, his steady breathing spreading through the fabric of her pants. Josie meant to sit there for only a few minutes. She fell asleep before she could decide. 2 o'clock in the morning. Sterling walked down the hallway. He saw Josie asleep on the floor, her back against the wall, her head tilted to one side. Brick lay curled around her, his head pressed against her hip. Sterling stopped, looked. Then he went into his room, took out a blanket, came back, and laid it over her. He didn't touch her. He stood there for one more moment. Then he left. Josie woke just as the sky began to lighten, her neck stiff, her back aching, the imprint of the wall pressed into her face. Brick was still curled around her, his eyes open, watching her as if he had stayed awake on guard all night. The blanket over her wasn't hers. She looked at it for a while, then folded it neatly and placed it on the chair inside the room. She went downstairs to the kitchen, washed her hands, and took the bandage-changing supplies from her bag. Brick followed her, 3 legs on the floor, his rear leg held suspended, but he moved faster than he had the night before. A good sign. She helped him onto the kitchen table, removed the old bandage, and examined the suture line under the daylight. The stitches were clean, 14 stitches, even, with no sign of inflammation within the first 12 hours. She checked circulation by pressing gently against the pad of his paw, counting the capillary refill time. Normal. The dog would keep his leg. But it wasn't the stitches that made her stop. She looked at the trap. It was still lying on the kitchen floor, where the guards had left it the night before, its 2 jaws spread wide open. In the warehouse at night, she had focused only on cutting the trap and treating the wound. She hadn't had time to look closely. Now, under the white kitchen light, she saw clearly. The teeth of the trap had been sharpened again, not worn down naturally over time and then filed sharp by someone. This was deliberate sharpening, done with a specialized tool, the grinding angle even, tooth by tooth. And the cutting angle of the trap's jaws when they snapped shut wasn't aimed at the thickest muscle of the leg, where an ordinary capture trap would clamp down to hold an animal alive. This angle was aimed at the back of the joint, where the flexor tendon lay closest beneath the skin. If Brick had jerked hard when the trap flexed, and the instinct of any dog was to jerk, the tendon would have snapped. Not torn, snapped completely. The dog would never walk normally again. Josie had seen hundreds of trap wounds in her life. Careless hunter traps, oversized rat traps, industrial traps for large animals. She knew the difference between an accidental trap and a trap with intent. This one had intent. She pushed her hair out of her face, wiped her hands on a towel, and went to find Sterling. His office was on the first floor, at the end of the east hallway. The door was closed. She knocked twice. She didn't wait to be invited in. She opened the door and stepped inside. Sterling was seated behind his desk, papers in front of him, his phone turned face down. He looked up when she entered, not surprised, as if he had been waiting for her to come to him, only not knowing when she would. "The trap," Josie said. She didn't sit down. The teeth were sharpened again with a tool. The cutting angle was aimed straight at the hamstring tendon. Whoever set this trap didn't want to catch your dog. They wanted to cripple him permanently. Sterling's face didn't change, but Josie saw his right hand tighten on the desk, the fingers slowly curling into his palm, the kind of tightening that belonged to a man who didn't allow a reaction to reach his face, so his body drove it down into his hand. "Who knew Brick's evening release schedule?" she asked. He looked at her. That question wasn't a veterinarian's question. It was the question of someone who understood that a trap placed in the right spot required the person who set it to know where the prey would pass, and when. 5 people, he said. "Then you have 4 people to check, and 1 person to look at more closely." She turned and walked out. At the door she stopped, but didn't turn her head. "Someone in your house wants to hurt that dog, or they want to hurt you through that dog. You can choose which meaning you prefer." She left. The door closed behind her. Sterling sat alone. 5 names. 4 had been beside him for more than 10 years. Men whose histories he knew, whose habits he knew, even which side they slept on. And Gregor Holst, 12 years. The man who, yesterday morning, when the guards reported that Brick had been caught in a trap, he had listened while everyone else in the room asked where, or when, or, "Is the dog all right?" Gregor had nodded, only nodded, as if he had already known that news was coming, and was simply waiting for it to arrive so he could go do something else. Sterling opened his fist, looked at his 5 fingers stretched out on the surface of the desk. Then he picked up the phone. That afternoon, Perry Lang knocked on the door of Sterling's office. Perry was the legal advisor of the Voss organization, the keeper of its internal law, the man who made sure that everything within this territory operated according to the rules set in place long before Sterling took power. Perry brought no one with him. He didn't need to. Perry's weapon was rules, and inside the Voss organization, rules weighed more than guns. "That woman needs to leave," Perry said. He stood in front of Sterling's desk, his back straight, his hands clasped behind him, his voice calm, like a man reading a contract clause. "She entered the territory without permission, without passing border control, without anyone to vouch for her. Under internal law, Section 7, Article 3, that is unlawful intrusion. The penalty is expulsion and a ban on returning." Sterling didn't answer right away. He looked at Perry for a while, then said, "Call her up." Josie was called to the meeting room on the first floor. She entered with antiseptic still marked on her hands from changing Brick's bandage at noon. She looked at Perry. Perry looked at her. The 2 of them had never met before, but Josie recognized his type immediately. The kind of person who lived by printed words on paper and believed the world would function properly if everyone read from the same page. "Miss Mercer," Perry said, "you violated the boundary of Voss territory. No permit, no consent from any member of the organization, no valid reason under internal law. The rule is very clear. There are no exceptions." Josie looked at him. "The dog would have lost his leg if I'd waited for your permit. That isn't a valid basis. It's the only reason I needed." Perry drew in a breath, the kind of breath taken by a man trying to stay calm in front of someone who refused to play by the rules. "Miss Mercer, I'm not judging your motives. I'm speaking about rules. Rules exist to protect this organization. If we make an exception for you, we make an exception for everyone. I'm not everyone. I'm the only person that dog allows to touch him." Perry opened his mouth to say more, but the meeting room door opened. Sterling stepped in. He had been in the hallway. Josie didn't know how long he had been standing there, or how much he had heard. He didn't look at Josie. He looked at Perry. "She stays," Sterling said. His voice didn't rise. It didn't press harder. Flat, even. The kind of voice no one in the room needed to hear a second time in order to understand. "Anyone who touches her is touching me." Perry stood still. He looked at Sterling, calculating. He was a legal advisor, not a fool. He knew the difference between an order that could be negotiated and an order that couldn't. This belonged to the second kind. "I'll put it in the record," Perry said, his voice level. Then he left the room. Josie stood, took her tool bag from the chair, and walked out into the hallway. Sterling walked ahead of her. She caught up with him in the stretch of hallway near the stairs. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I could have handled it myself." Sterling stopped walking. He didn't turn around. "I know." "Then why did you still do it?" He stood still for a moment. Then he kept walking, heading up the stairs, without answering. Josie stood alone in the hallway. Afternoon light slipped through the narrow window set into the stone wall, laying a long streak across the floor. She watched Sterling's shadow disappear at the top of the stairs, and she thought this was the first time in a very long while that someone had stood on her side without making her ask, without making her explain, without making her prove she deserved to stand there. He had simply walked in, said one sentence, and left, as if the matter didn't need to be discussed. She stood there a little longer. Then she went down to the kitchen to change Brick's bandage. On the morning of the third day, Josie removed Brick's bandage, and she knew at once. The skin around the sutures was red, swollen, and hot to the touch. The surrounding tissue had begun to leak cloudy fluid. Brick was breathing faster than usual, lying on his side on the kitchen floor, ignoring the bowl of food Margaret had placed beside him early that morning. Josie laid the back of her hand against his nose. Hot, against his ears. Hot, against his belly. Hot, infection. Josie checked the suture line again, stitch by stitch. The stitches were clean. There was no problem with the technique. The infection was coming from inside, from the deeper damaged tissue she had treated but hadn't been able to clean completely under the conditions of field surgery on a kitchen table. She needed antibiotics, not the ordinary kind bought at a pet pharmacy for dogs. A specialized kind, given by injection into the vein, available only at a licensed veterinary clinic or a large animal hospital, the place she was forbidden to enter. She sat on the kitchen floor beside Brick, her hand resting on his chest as she counted his breaths. Faster than normal. Without antibiotics within the next 12 hours, the infection would spread into his blood. By then, it wouldn't be about losing the leg anymore. It would be about losing the dog. She went to find Sterling. He was in his office. She walked in without knocking, for the second time in 2 days. He made no comment about it. "Brick has an infection," she said. "I need specialized antibiotics for dogs. Injectable, not oral. They're only available at a veterinary clinic or an animal hospital. Then go get them. I can't." Sterling looked at her, waiting. Josie drew in a breath. She didn't want to tell it. She hadn't told anyone in 2 years. Not because she was ashamed, but because every time she told it, she had to look again at the face of the man who had once lain beside her every night, then stabbed her in the back every morning. But Brick was feverish on the kitchen floor, and she didn't have time for pride. "My veterinary license was revoked 2 years ago," she said. Her voice didn't rise or fall, flat as if she were reading from an official report. "My ex-boyfriend was a veterinarian at the same clinic in Chicago. He stole restricted pharmaceuticals from the clinic's storage room to sell outside. When he got caught, he blamed all of it on me. The evidence pointed to me because he used my storage access account. I lost my license, my job, my home. No one believed me." 5 sentences. 2 years of her life folded into 5 sentences. When she finished, she looked at Sterling and waited. She was used to the look people gave after hearing that story. Pity, or suspicion, or both. Sterling had neither. He looked at her with unchanged eyes, then asked, "What's his name?" Josie blinked. That wasn't the question she had been waiting for. "You don't need to know." "I didn't ask what you need. I asked his name." Josie looked at him. He looked back. She didn't answer. Not because she didn't want to give him that name, but because she didn't know what he would do with it, and she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Sterling didn't ask a third time. He picked up the phone and dialed a number. The call lasted 30 seconds. He spoke 4 sentences, his voice even. No explanation. No negotiation. Then he hung up. "The medicine will arrive before midnight," he said. Josie didn't ask how. She went back down to the kitchen, back beside Brick. The medicine arrived at 11 o'clock at night. A car stopped in front of the mansion. Someone got out, handed a cold bag to the guard, then drove away. No name, no receipt, no questions. Josie opened the bag. The right medication, the right dosage. She didn't ask where it had come from. She gave Brick the first injection into the vein in his front leg. The dog groaned once, then lay still. Josie sat down on the kitchen floor beside him, her hand on his chest, counting his breaths. Still fast. The fever hadn't broken. Sterling entered the kitchen at midnight. He didn't ask about the situation. He looked at Brick, looked at Josie sitting on the floor, then moved around to the opposite side and sat down with his back against the kitchen cabinets. He placed Brick's head in his lap, one hand on the dog's neck, and he stayed there. 1 o'clock in the morning. The fever still hadn't broken. Josie gave the second injection. Brick groaned, his eyes cloudy, his breathing still rapid. Josie kept her hand on his chest, counting each shallow breath as the seconds ticked away. 2 o'clock in the morning. The kitchen was silent. There was only Brick's breathing, the clock on the wall, and the faint rain outside the window that had begun at some point without anyone noticing. Sterling spoke, not looking at Josie, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the kitchen window. My wife's name was Delia. He stopped, not to breathe. He stopped because that name was heavier than he remembered. 4 years ago, she was attacked while she was outside the protected zone. I received the call in a meeting room. I ran. By the time I got there, it was too late. 4 sentences. He said 4 sentences in a voice that didn't shake, didn't break, but Josie heard the cost of that calmness. The voice of a man who had rehearsed that sentence in his head thousands of times and had never once spoken it aloud until tonight, on the kitchen floor, at 2 o'clock in the morning, while his wife's dog burned with fever between 2 strangers who had become familiar. Josie didn't say, "I'm sorry." She had heard that sentence too many times in her own life, from people who weren't truly sorry, and she knew how useless it was when you were sitting in the middle of wreckage. "You've been carrying everything alone since that day," she said. It wasn't a question. Sterling looked at her for the first time since he had begun speaking. "So have you." Silence. Brick breathed. Rain fell outside the window. The clock ticked. 2 people sat on the cold kitchen floor, their backs against the cabinets, the dog lying between them, and the silence didn't need anyone to break it, because it wasn't an empty silence. It was the kind of silence made by 2 people who had just set something heavy down and were sitting there, breathing. 3 o'clock in the morning. Josie checked his temperature. Still high. She gave the 3rd injection. Brick cried out softly, his eyes closed, his ears twitching. Sterling held his head, more gently now, whispering into the dog's ear words Josie still couldn't hear clearly. 3:45. Josie placed the back of her hand against Brick's nose. Still hot. She checked his pulse. Fast, but steadier. It might be a sign. It might not. 4 o'clock in the morning. Josie laid her hand on Brick's chest, counted. His breathing had slowed. She placed the back of her hand against his nose. Warm, not hot. Against his ears. Warm. Against his belly. Warm. She checked again. Checked one more time. Then she breathed out, long and deep, as if she had been holding her breath from 11 o'clock at night until now. "He'll get through it," she said. Sterling looked at Brick. Then he looked at Josie. His eyes were gray in the kitchen light, and she saw something in them that he didn't say aloud, but it was there, as clear as the lowered heat on the dog's nose. "So will you," he said. Josie didn't know whether he was talking about the dog or about her. She thought maybe he was talking about both. On the 4th day, Brick's fever had completely broken. He was eating again, drinking water on his own, and moving on 3 legs so quickly that Josie had to remind him to slow down every time he followed her down the stairs. The stitches were healing, and the infection had been brought under control. Josie was changing Brick's bandage in the kitchen when she heard footsteps at the door. Gregor Holst walked in, a 45-year-old man with broad shoulders, closely cropped hair, and the stride of someone used to every door in this mansion opening for him. He was Sterling's second in command, 12 years at his side, the man the entire Voss organization regarded as his right hand. Brick growled. It wasn't the growl of a dog in pain, the one Josie had heard at the warehouse on the first night. This was different. Lower, steadier, coming from deep inside his chest, the kind of sound a dog made only when it recognized something human eyes hadn't yet seen. A warning. Josie placed her hand on Brick's back. He stopped growling, but his eyes never left Gregor. They followed every step Gregor took from the doorway to the center of the kitchen. Gregor looked at the dog, then at Josie, then gave a small smile. "He's always hated me." Josie didn't answer. She kept wrapping Brick's bandage, but she noted it. Dogs didn't hate without reason. Dogs weren't good at hiding things, weren't good at diplomacy, and didn't growl at someone simply out of habit. If Brick growled at this man while he had lain still for a complete stranger to touch him since the first night, then that growl had a reason. Sterling entered the kitchen from the hallway. He looked at Gregor, looked at Brick, and read the situation in 2 seconds. "Boss," Gregor said, turning to Sterling, his voice easy, familiar, the voice of a man who had spoken to the person across from him thousands of times. "I heard Brick got trapped at the warehouse. Is he all right now? Was the trap at the east warehouse or the west one?" Sterling didn't answer right away. He looked at Gregor. From anyone else, that question would have sounded normal, concerned, inquiring. But Sterling hadn't told anyone which warehouse Brick had been trapped in. Only the guards at the scene knew that information, and Sterling knew it. Yet Gregor asked east or west, as if he knew there were 2 warehouses, knew the trap had been in one of them, and simply wasn't sure which. "East," Sterling said. His voice was normal. His face was normal. Nothing changed. Gregor nodded. Then he glanced toward Josie, as she wrapped Brick's bandage, lowered his voice, and said to Sterling, "This woman, how much longer is she staying here? Do you need me to handle it?" "Handle it." Josie didn't look up, but she heard every word clearly. She also heard that handle it didn't mean arrange for her to leave. It was heavier than that. It carried the weight of a word people used in this world when they wanted someone to disappear. "No," Sterling said. One word. No explanation. Gregor looked at Sterling for a moment, then nodded again. "Understood." He turned and walked out through the kitchen door, his footsteps fading down the hallway. Brick watched Gregor's shadow until he was completely gone. Only then did he look back at Josie, lower his head, and breathe out a long breath, as if he had been holding it ever since Gregor walked in. Josie tied the final knot in the bandage. Without looking up, she said, "The dog doesn't like that man." "I know," Sterling said. "You should listen to the dog. Dogs don't know diplomacy." Sterling stood at the kitchen door, one hand resting against the frame. Josie looked up, and for the first time since she had met this man, she saw something behind the layer of control on his face. Not anger, not suspicion. Sadness. The slow, heavy kind of sadness that belonged to someone watching something he didn't want to see take shape right in front of him, from a man he had once trusted with 12 years of memory. The kind of sadness that belonged to someone who knew the answer but didn't want to say it yet, because saying it meant making it true, and once something was true, it couldn't be taken back. He said nothing more. He pushed himself away from the doorframe and walked toward his office. Josie watched him go, then looked down at Brick. The dog looked back at her with calm, certain brown eyes, the eyes of an animal that didn't need proof to know who should be trusted and who shouldn't. She gently patted his head. "I know," she whispered. "I heard." On the 6th day, Gregor Holst walked into Sterling's office at 9 o'clock in the morning with a piece of information. There was an urgent meeting with the Southern partners at the Port District, a problem involving a shipment being held at the customs border. Only Sterling had enough authority to handle it in person. They needed to leave at once, that afternoon. Sterling looked at Gregor, the man who had been beside him for 12 years, the man who knew his schedule, knew his routes, knew where his dog ran every evening. He still had no concrete proof, only one wrong question in the kitchen, one nod that had been too calm, and the instinct of a dog. He went. 3 cars. The route Gregor suggested, through the Southern Port District. The road beneath the port overpass was narrow, concrete walls on both sides, the steel belly of the bridge above, no cameras. One way in, one way out. Sterling realized that when the first car had just entered beneath the bridge, and he realized it a little too late, the lead car was blocked. A black van sat sideways across the road. No lights, no license plate. The driver of the lead car slammed the brakes. Behind them, 2 more cars appeared, sealing the exit. Doors opened. Men poured out. Fast. Organized. Not a street gang. These were soldiers from the Carver organization. The firefight was brief. 15 seconds. Maybe 20. Sterling's escort driver was hit in the shoulder. Lost control. and the car veered left into the concrete wall. Sterling was in the second car. He opened the door before the car had fully stopped, took cover behind the body of the vehicle, and in the next 10 seconds he took down 3 men blocking the front. Not because he was faster than they were, because he was calmer. While they ran and fired, he stood still behind the car, aimed, and ended it. The 4th bullet, from behind, lodged in his left shoulder. It tore through muscle, ripped open the fabric of his jacket, and he felt the heat before he felt the pain. He didn't look down. He got into the second car, the engine still running, hit the gas, rammed the van blocking the road to one side, and escaped from under the bridge. On the way back, he drove with one hand. His left arm could no longer lift. His shoulder was soaked, and the seat had begun to absorb the blood. He took his phone with his right hand and dialed Margaret. Locked down the entire mansion. His voice was even slow. The kind of calm that anyone hearing it would understand was more dangerous than shouting. Gregor isn't allowed to leave the grounds. No one goes out. No one comes in. I'll be home in 15 minutes. He hung up. He knew. The moment the car was blocked beneath the bridge, he knew. The route Gregor had suggested. A location with no cameras. One way in, one way out. Carver soldiers, not a street gang. There was only one person inside the Voss organization who both knew his schedule today and had ties deep enough with Carver to arrange an organized ambush within 48 hours. Sterling drove back to the mansion gates. He stopped the car. His right hand released the steering wheel. His eyes saw the guards running toward the vehicle. Then the image blurred, then went dark. When he was carried into the kitchen, Josie was there. She was washing tools after changing Brick's bandage that afternoon. She heard running footsteps, shouting, the door opening. Then 2 guards carried Sterling in and laid him on the kitchen table, the oak table. His shirt was soaked at the left shoulder, his face pale, his eyes closed. Margaret arrived after them, walking fast but not running. She looked at her son on the table. She lifted the phone and called the organization's private doctor. In New York, 3 hours away. She looked at Josie. Josie was standing beside the table, holding the freshly washed bandage scissors, her eyes fixed on the wound in Sterling's shoulder. The wound was still bleeding, muscle torn, tissue opened, and beneath the layer of muscle she could see a small fragment lodged there, glinting under the kitchen light. "Save my son," Margaret said. Josie looked at Margaret, looked at Sterling, looked at her own hands. She was a veterinarian, not a surgeon, but she knew shoulder muscles, the deltoid, the rotator cuff, the branching vessels. She had operated on dog shoulders dozens of times, and dog shoulders and human shoulders in this area were not very different in structure. And the fragment in the wound was shallow, in the muscle layer, not near a main vessel. 3 seconds. She hesitated for exactly 3 seconds. Then she opened her tool bag. "I need better light, small forceps, suture thread, and everyone out of the kitchen except you." Margaret gave the order. The guards withdrew. The kitchen door closed. Only 3 people and 1 dog remained. Josie washed her hands again. She cut Sterling's shirt open at the shoulder, fully exposing the wound. She disinfected it, examined it. The fragment lay inside the deltoid muscle, about 2 centimeters from a branching vessel. If she was careful, she could remove it. If her hand shook, she would cut into the vessel. Her hand didn't shake. Her hand had never shaken on an operating table in her life. Not even on the first night when she operated on Brick on this same table. Her hands shook afterward, never while she was working. She clamped the small bleeding vessel, stopped the blood. Then she guided the forceps in, gentle, slow, searching for the fragment. Contact. The metal made a faint click when the forceps met the fragment. She gripped it, pulled it out, steady-handed. The small, twisted, red-stained piece of metal fell into the stainless steel tray on the table. She stopped the bleeding again, checked to make sure no fragment remained. Then she sutured. 11 stitches. Not as quickly as she had stitched Brick, because she was more careful, because this was a person, because she knew that if she placed 1 stitch wrong, she wouldn't just lose a patient. She would lose something else she wasn't ready to name. Brick lay under the table throughout the entire process. Not guarding Josie, not guarding Sterling, guarding both of them. His eyes moved back and forth between the two, and he lay still, breathing evenly, as if his calm was the thing keeping the kitchen from collapsing. Josie tied the final stitch, bandaged the wound, checked his pulse, his blood pressure by hand, his breathing, Stable. He had lost blood, but not enough to endanger his life. He would wake. She stepped back. Her hands trembled. Now they trembled. She closed both hands into fists and waited for it to pass. Sterling opened his eyes 10 minutes later. His eyes found the kitchen ceiling first, then turned, searching. They found Josie. She was sitting on the chair beside the table, her hands not yet fully clean, her hair messy, her face exhausted. "You saved another life on this table," he said, his voice hoarse and low. "This table's starting to get used to it," Josie replied. She didn't smile, but the corner of her mouth shifted upward, and Sterling saw it. And it was the first thing he saw when he woke after nearly dying. Margaret stood in the kitchen doorway. She looked at her son on the table, then at the woman sitting beside him. She placed a hand over her chest and held it there for one brief moment. Then she turned away. On the 7th day, Sterling sat at the head of the table in his office. His left shoulder was still bandaged, his face paler than usual, but he sat straight, both hands resting on the tabletop, and anyone who walked into that room would understand that the man before them wasn't recovering. He was waiting. On the table, between his hands, was the trap, its 2 iron jaws spread wide open, its sharpened teeth gleaming, its hinge severed by Josie in the warehouse 7 nights earlier. He had ordered someone to bring it up from the kitchen that morning. Set it on the table. Leave it there. He ordered Gregor to be called. Gregor stepped into the room. The door closed behind him. Outside, 2 of Sterling's men stood on either side. Gregor had seen them. He understood they weren't standing there to protect. They were standing there to block. Gregor looked at Sterling. Then his eyes moved down to the table, and he saw the trap. Gregor's face changed. Quickly. Very quickly. A moment anyone else would have missed. Half a second in which his jaw tightened and his eyes widened by the smallest fraction, before everything was pulled back into place, controlled again, the mask set back on. But Sterling had seen it. Sterling hadn't taken his eyes off Gregor since the door opened, and he had seen that half second as clearly as daylight. "Sit down," Sterling said. Gregor sat, the chair across from Sterling, the trap lying between them on the table. Silence. Sterling let it stretch. He knew the value of silence. He knew that when a guilty man sat in front of evidence, every second of silence was another second that man had to fight himself not to say the wrong thing. "This trap was set at the East Warehouse," Sterling said. His voice was low, slow, each word placed on the table like a chess piece. "Right on Brick's evening route." The teeth were sharpened again. "The warehouse location was known only to the guards at the scene and to me." He stopped. "But in the kitchen," you asked, "east or west? You knew there were 2 warehouses. No one told you that." Gregor opened his mouth. Sterling lifted one hand, lightly, as if brushing away a fly. Gregor closed his mouth. "The meeting at the southern port," Sterling continued. "You suggested the route. That route went beneath the port overpass. A camera blind spot. One way in, one way out. Carver soldiers, not a street gang. Organized. Prepared." He looked at Gregor. "How long have you been working for Carver?" Gregor didn't answer. He sat still, both hands on his thighs, looking at the trap in the middle of the table. No denial, no begging, no explanation. He had been a lieutenant long enough to know that when Sterling asked a question like that, the question didn't need an answer. It was a sentence already passed. Sterling stood, slowly, because his shoulder still hurt. But he didn't let anyone see that pain affect the way he rose. He walked around the table toward Gregor and stopped 2 paces away from him. Looked down. 12 years, Sterling said. "You were beside me for 12 years. You knew the dog's name. You knew that dog had followed Delia since he was a newborn. You knew he slept at the foot of her bed every night. You knew that when she died, he wouldn't let anyone touch him for 4 years. You knew he was the only thing I still had left from her." Sterling's voice dropped lower, not a whisper. It was the kind of voice that fell beneath the level ordinary people used for conversation. The kind everyone in the Voss organization knew was Sterling's most dangerous voice, because it meant he no longer needed to raise it to make anyone afraid. "And you trapped him." Gregor looked down, not bowing his head in remorse, bowing his head because he saw that every exit had closed, and he was practical enough not to try running when there was nowhere left to run. "You didn't betray me," Sterling said. "You betrayed Delia." The room was so silent that Josie, standing outside in the hallway, could hear the office wall clock ticking. Sterling turned away, walked back toward the table. Didn't look at Gregor again. "Take him away." The door opened. 2 men stepped inside and stood on either side of Gregor. He rose. No resistance. No more words. He walked out of the room between the 2 men, and that was the last time anyone in the Voss mansion ever saw Gregor Holst. The door closed. Sterling sat back down in his chair, alone. The trap still lay on the table. In the middle of the room, its 2 iron jaws spread wide like a mouth laughing. He looked at it. 12 years. He thought about 12 years. About the nights Gregor had sat in that chair discussing strategy. About the times Gregor had stood behind him when he faced his enemies. About the dinner where Gregor had sat beside Dahlia and raised a glass to toast her birthday 7 years ago. 12 years of memories, and now every memory had a second layer beneath it. One he would have to question for himself, one by one, which had been real and which had not. He didn't slam the table, didn't throw the trap, didn't shout. He sat still, and he was tired. Not tired because of the wound in his shoulder, tired because of betrayal. Josie entered the room 5 minutes later. She had been standing in the hallway when Gregor was taken away. She had seen the faces of the 2 guards, white and drained. She had seen Gregor walking between them, head lowered, silent. She didn't need anyone to explain. She opened the door and stepped inside. Sterling sat at the head of the table, the trap in front of him. He didn't look up when she came in, but he knew she was there. Josie looked at the trap, looked at Sterling. She understood. She understood because she had once sat on that side too. The side of someone who had just discovered that the person they trusted most was the person destroying them. She didn't ask what had happened. She pulled out the chair and sat down across from him. The trap lay between them. 12 years? Sterling said. He didn't look at her. He looked at the trap. I know what that feels like, Josie said. Her voice was soft. Not soft because she was trying to be gentle, but soft because the sentence was too heavy to say loudly, trusting someone completely. Then one day discovering it was all a lie. And the worst part isn't the lie. The worst part is sitting alone afterward with a pile of memories and not knowing which ones are still true. Sterling looked at her for the first time since she had entered the room. He said nothing, but he looked at her with the eyes of a man who had just heard someone describe the wound inside him exactly, without him needing to show them where it was. They sat in silence. No one said anything more. Brick entered the room, 3 legs on the floor, his rear leg held suspended. He slipped beneath the table and lay down at Sterling's feet, his head resting on Sterling's shoe. Heavy, warm, quiet. 3 figures in the room. 2 people, 1 dog, the trap on the table. And the silence, the kind of silence no one needed to break, because it was the only kind that made sense when both people in the room knew what betrayal looked like. On the morning of the 8th day, Josie went down to the kitchen the way she had every morning since she had stayed at the Voss mansion. Brick followed behind her, 3 legs on the floor, his rear leg already beginning to touch down lightly when he stepped. A good sign of recovery. She meant to make coffee, take out the supplies to change his bandage, and begin the day in the same order she had followed for the past 7 days. But Sterling was already there. He was sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in front of him, his left shoulder still bandaged, and on the table, between his coffee cup and the place where Josie usually sat, was a brown envelope. Thick, the kind meant for documents, not letters. Sit down, Sterling said. Josie sat. She looked at the envelope, looked at Sterling. He pushed the envelope toward her with 2 fingers. Open it. Josie opened the envelope. Inside was a file. She pulled it out, set it on the table, and began to read. On the first page, she didn't understand. On the second page, she began to understand. On the third page, her hand stopped on the paper. Screenshots of messages. Messages between her ex-boyfriend and a contact who bought restricted pharmaceuticals in the suburbs of Chicago. Dates, times, content, account names. The next page showed money transfer records. 3 intermediary accounts, amounts, dates, all matching the times when the pharmaceuticals disappeared from the clinic storage room. The next page was the clinic's original inventory report, the one Josie had never been allowed to see because it had been altered before the board reviewed her case. The original showing that the pharmaceuticals had disappeared during her ex-boyfriend's shifts, not hers. And the final page was a signed statement from a former clinic employee. Someone who had seen him open the storage room at midnight 3 times during the final month, someone who had stayed silent out of fear of losing their job, and now wasn't silent anymore. Josie read every page. Slowly. She read the inventory report twice. She read the employee statement 3 times. Her finger moved along the lines of text as if she were afraid that if she read too quickly, it would disappear. 2 years. For 2 years, she had tried to find these things. 2 years of knocking on lawyers' doors without money to hire them, filing complaints without evidence, calling old colleagues while no one picked up. 2 years living in the cheapest rented room outside Boston, treating stray dogs with tools bought from second-hand markets, eating instant noodles, and every night before sleep, staring up at the ceiling and wondering whether anyone in the world would ever believe her. Sterling had done in 5 days what she couldn't do in 2 years. She set the file down on the table, looked at Sterling. "I didn't ask your permission," he said. "I knew you would say no." "Why?" Josie asked. Her voice sounded different. She heard that it sounded different, and she couldn't control the difference. It was thinner, lighter, as if something inside her was cracking, and she was trying to hold it together, but it was cracking faster than her hands could keep up. Sterling looked at her. He didn't look away, didn't look down at his coffee cup, didn't look out the window. He looked straight into her eyes when he spoke. "Because that night, you drove into Dock Ward not for me. You didn't know whose dog that was. You didn't know whose territory this was. You only heard that he was in pain, and you stopped the car." He stopped, not to breathe. He stopped because he had been thinking of the next sentence for a long time, but this was the first time he had said it aloud. "A person like that shouldn't have to live without a name." Josie looked at him. Then she looked down at the file on the table. Then she looked back at him. Tears fell without a sound, a word, or a sob. They ran down her cheeks, dropping onto the oak tabletop and soaking into the first page of the file. She didn't turn her face away or lift a hand to wipe them. For the first time in 2 years, she allowed herself to cry in front of another person. Josie Mercer hadn't cried when she lost her license, hadn't cried when she lost her home, hadn't cried when the man she loved looked straight into her face before the medical board and said she was the one who had taken the drugs, hadn't cried when she drove away from Chicago with 1 tool bag and nothing else. She had held everything together by not letting anyone see it, because every time someone saw her weak, she gave them something to use against her. But this morning, at the kitchen table in the Voss mansion, in front of a man whose name she hadn't known 8 days earlier, she finally let go of her fear. Brick rose from where he had been lying in the corner of the kitchen, slipped under the table, and pressed himself against Josie's legs. His entire 150 pounds body leaned against her shin, heavy, warm, and she could feel his breathing through the fabric of her pants, steady, slow, calm, as if he were holding her to the earth with the weight of his body. Sterling stood. He lifted his coffee cup from the table, went to the sink, then walked through the kitchen door and out into the hallway. He said nothing more. He didn't look back, not because he didn't want to stay, but because he understood that some moments needed to be owned alone, and someone who respected her enough would leave so she could cry without having to cry for anyone to see. Josie sat alone in the kitchen, the file on the table, Brick at her feet. The tears kept falling, fewer now, slower, then stopped. She drew in a breath, let it out, breathed in, breathed out. Then she reached down and placed her hand on Brick's head. He was warm. He was here. And on the table before her, for the first time in 2 years, was proof that the truth still existed. Only she had needed a man who ran half the city from the shadows to help dig it up. On the morning of the 9th day, the sky had not fully brightened yet. The kitchen was still dark, with only the small light over the counter that Josie had turned on when she came down at 4:30. She couldn't sleep. She hadn't been able to sleep since she read the file yesterday afternoon, read it again last night, read it one more time before going to bed, then lay staring at the ceiling until there was nothing left in the ceiling to look at. Brick lay at her feet, pressing himself against the chair leg, breathing evenly. The dog slept well. The dog had no file to read. Josie opened the envelope again. This time, she didn't read each page. She flipped through quickly, checking the messages, the transactions, the original inventory report, and the statement. Everything was still there. She wasn't afraid it would disappear. She only needed to be sure last night hadn't been a dream. It wasn't a dream. She set the file down on the table, sat still for a while. Then she picked up her phone, Rachel Dunn's number. Josie had saved this number 2 years ago, after their only meeting at the free office inside the Chicago Legal Aid Center. Rachel had listened to her story, had believed her, had said, "I can help, but you need evidence. Without evidence, I can't do anything. Josie had no evidence. She thanked Rachel, walked out, and kept the phone number in her phone for 2 years, the way a person keeps a door when she doesn't have the key. Now she had the key. She pressed call. The phone rang 4 times. 5 times. Josie looked at the wall clock. 10 minutes to 5. Early. Maybe too early. The 6th ring. Then someone picked up. The voice sleepy but sharpening quickly when Josie said her name. Josie Mercer. 2 years ago, Chicago Legal Aid Office. You said I needed evidence. A brief silence came from the other end of the line. Then Rachel's voice. I remember you. I have evidence. Messages, transactions, the original inventory report, witness testimony. I'm sending it by email right now. I want to reopen the case. Josie spoke clearly, sentence by sentence, without stumbling, without shaking. Her voice was calm in the way only people who had waited a very long time could be calm, when the moment they had waited for finally arrived. Not rushed, not frantic, just certain. Rachel asked a few questions. Josie answered. Briefly, directly, like she was reading from a report. Then Rachel said, Send it to me. I'll review it today. Thank you, Josie said. Then she ended the call. The phone lay back on the table. Her hands trembled. Now they trembled. Not from fear, not from nervousness. They trembled because for 2 years she had clenched her hands tight, had held everything in, had taken one step after another through the dark, without knowing whether anyone was waiting on the other side. And this morning, she had just crossed over by herself. She closed her hands into fists, waited for it to pass. Then she opened her laptop, opened her email, photographed every page of the file, attached them, and sent them. Done. She closed the laptop. Brick shifted beneath her feet, pressing himself closer, as if he could feel the tremor in her body through the floor. Sterling stood at the kitchen door. He had been coming down for coffee, as he did every morning, and he heard Josie's voice before he saw her. He stopped at the doorway, heard her talking to the lawyer, heard her end the call, heard the sound of her setting the phone down on the table. He didn't step inside. He stood there until she finished sending the email, closed the laptop, and sat still with both hands clenched on the table. Then he stepped back, quietly, turned away, and walked toward his office. He didn't need to enter the kitchen. Coffee could wait. He had given her the tool. She had taken it in her own hands and stepped forward by herself. That was exactly what he had thought would happen, and that was exactly why. On the afternoon of the 9th day, Josie was sitting alone in the kitchen. Brick lay asleep under the table. She was rereading the confirmation email from Rachel Dunn, the attorney who had received the file that morning, and replied that she would review it within 48 hours. 48 hours. After 2 years, 48 hours sounded like a miracle. Margaret stepped into the kitchen. She didn't make coffee, didn't get water, didn't do anything that would create a reason for her to be there. She pulled out a chair, sat down across from Josie, placed both hands on the table, and looked at her. Josie set her phone face down, looked back at Margaret. She had been in this mansion long enough to know that when Margaret Voss sat down across from someone without holding anything in her hands, she was about to say something she had thought through carefully before speaking. He hasn't said Delia's name to anyone in 4 years, Margaret said. No opening. No, I want to tell you something. No. Do you have a moment? She spoke directly, the way she did everything in this house. Since the day she died, he has held everything together by will alone. The territory, the organization, the people, all of it. Like a man clenching his fist because he's afraid that if he opens it, there won't be anything left inside. She stopped, looked at Josie. Her eyes weren't soft, and they weren't hard. They were exact. The eyes of a woman who had lived 60 years and no longer had time to speak in circles. Then you walked into that warehouse, and Brick put his head on your lap, and he opened his hand. Josie sat still. She heard every word. She understood every word, and she felt each word touch the exact place she had been trying not to look at for the past 9 days. I trusted someone, Josie said. Her voice was quiet, not because she was trying to lower it, but because what she was about to say was so heavy, she could only say it softly. That person took everything from me, my career, my home, my reputation, everything I had built over 10 years. I'm not afraid of Sterling. She stopped. I'm afraid of myself, afraid that I'll trust again, and lose everything again. Margaret looked at her. No nodding, no shaking her head, no advice. No, I understand. Because she knew that saying, I understand to someone who had been betrayed was like saying, I know how to swim, to someone who was drowning. That's the difference, Margaret said. The last time, you trusted because you didn't know yet. You didn't know people could look you straight in the face and stab you in the back at the same time. This time, you know it clearly. You know every line and grain of that pain. She looked at Josie. And you're still here. Josie didn't answer. She looked at Margaret, then down at the table, then out the kitchen window. Outside, the afternoon light was sinking low, laying a muted gold over the garden behind the mansion. The kind of light that only appears in the space between afternoon and evening, when everything is clear enough to see, yet dim enough that you don't have to look too closely. Margaret stood, pushed her chair in. She said nothing more, didn't pat Josie's shoulder, didn't hug her, didn't touch her. She knew there were people who needed to be touched and people who needed to be left alone, and Josie belonged to the second kind. She turned, walked out of the kitchen door, and went up the stairs. Joe sat alone. Brick woke beneath the table, shifted, then pressed himself against her leg. She lowered her hand, touched his back, and felt the steady rhythm of his breathing beneath her palm. She thought about what Margaret had said. The last time, she trusted because she didn't know yet. This time, she knew. And she was still here. The sentence was so simple she wanted to reject it, but she couldn't, because it was true. It was true in the way truth often is. Not loud, not dramatic, just lying there, in the middle of the table, waiting for her to look at it. On the 10th day, Brick walked on all 4 legs. Not 3.5 legs, not 3 legs with his rear leg only brushing the floor. 4 legs, fully, his weight evenly distributed, his steps steady across the stone floor of the Voss mansion hallway. Josie checked the stitches one last time early that morning. Healed. New tissue had closed over the wound. There was no sign of infection left. She removed the sutures. 4 stitches had already absorbed on their own, and she cut the remaining 10 one by one, gentle-handed, while Brick lay still on the kitchen floor and let her work without anyone needing to hold his head. The dog was well. Sterling was nearly healed, too. His left shoulder still hurt when he moved too sharply, but he had taken off the cloth bandage, leaving only a small gauze pad covering the stitches. He could move his arm, could put on a shirt, and that morning Josie saw him hold a coffee cup with his left hand for the first time since the night of the ambush. The reason Josie had stayed at the Voss mansion was gone. The dog had healed. The man had healed. She had cut a trap, operated on a dog, operated on a man, fought an infection, discovered that the trap had been set with intent, and sat on the kitchen floor at 2 o'clock in the morning, listening to a man say his late wife's name for the first time in 4 years. Nothing on that list required her to stay for an 11th day. Josie packed. There wasn't much to pack. The old leather tool bag, a few sets of clothes Margaret had lent her and that she had washed, folded neatly, and left on the bed, the half-empty bottle of antiseptic, the roll of gauze. She put everything into the bag, pulled the zipper shut, slung it over her shoulder, and went down the stairs. Brick followed her. Through the hallway, down the stairs, through the kitchen, out the front door. She opened the car door and put the bag on the back seat. When she turned back to say goodbye to Brick, the dog had already jumped into the car. A 150-pound Neapolitan Mastiff was sitting in the passenger seat of Josie Mercer's old car. He sat upright, looking forward through the windshield, calm, comfortable, as if he had been sitting in that seat all his life. "Get down," Josie said. Brick didn't look at her. He kept looking forward. Brick, down. Brick didn't move. Josie stood beside the car, both hands on her hips, staring at the 150-pound dog sitting in her passenger seat as if he had put a deposit on that spot last week. She didn't know whether she should laugh, cry, or call someone to come carry him out. And who could carry 150 pounds of dog when he had decided he wasn't going anywhere? He isn't getting down. Josie turned. Sterling stood on the mansion steps, his right hand in his pants pocket, his left shoulder slightly angled because the wound still pulled, and he was looking at her with Brick in the car. 10 days ago, he said. His voice was loud enough for her to hear from the car, but no louder than necessary. A woman drove into my territory at midnight, without permission, without knowing who I was. She heard a dog in pain, and she didn't keep driving. She cut the trap off his leg with cutters from an old tool bag, operated on him on my kitchen table, and 3 days later, On that same table, she removed a bullet fragment from my shoulder. He stepped down one step. I've lived by measuring everything. People, risks, distances. I know who can be trusted within 30 seconds of meeting them. I know who should be kept close and who should be kept away. I can measure all of it. He stopped. You're the first person I couldn't measure. Josie stood beside the car, her hands still on her hips, looking at him. She said nothing. She waited. Sterling stepped down another step. He was halfway down the steps. She was in the parking area, and the distance between them was 10 steps, maybe 12. But his voice filled that distance without needing to rise. You aren't like Delia, he said. I don't want you to be. Then don't compare us, Josie said. I'm not comparing. He looked at her. For 4 years, I've seen everything through a pane of fogged glass. Every face, every room, every morning. All of it blurred. You wiped that glass clean without ever asking permission. Josie felt every word of his touch her. Not in her ears, but somewhere deeper, in the place she had closed 2 years ago and thought would never open again. She stood beside her worn-out old car, another person's dog sitting in the passenger seat, and the man who ruled half the city was standing on the steps of his mansion, telling her she had wiped the glass clean for him. She hadn't known she had done that, but it was true. She knew it was true because she had seen more clearly too since the night she walked into that warehouse. If I stay, Josie said, I stay because I want to, not because of the dog, not because I have nowhere else to go, not because you cleared my name, or because you gave me a bedroom, or because Mrs. Voss makes good coffee. I know, Sterling said. Josie looked at him for another moment. Then she turned back to the car, opened the trunk, took out the tool bag, the old leather bag, frayed at the strap, the zipper jammed on one side, the inside still marked with antiseptic stains and the smell of surgical metal. That bag had followed her from Chicago to Boston, from the clinic to a rented room, from that rented room to warehouses and empty lots, where she treated stray dogs no one paid her to save. That bag was her home, her identity, the only thing she had left when everything else had been taken. She slung it over her shoulder, crossed the parking area, walked up the steps, past Sterling without stopping, reached the mansion door, where a small stone table stood beside the wall, and set the bag down on it. She said nothing. She put the bag down, let go, and straightened her back. Sterling looked at the bag on the stone table. He understood. He didn't need her to explain why she had placed it there, instead of taking it with her. He understood in the way people who were used to loss understood when someone decided to stay. Not through words, through action, through the way someone set down the most important thing they owned and didn't pick it up again. Brick jumped down from the car, ran 3 steps across the parking area, climbed the mansion steps, and lay down beside the bag. He rested his head on the stone surface beside the bag's strap, and he breathed out one long breath. In the afternoon, the back steps of the Voss mansion looked out over the small garden Margaret still tended with her own hands every morning, the only patch of green in Dock Ward. Josie sat on the stone step. Brick lay beside her, his head resting on her lap, heavy, warm, his eyes closed, exactly like the first night in the warehouse, when she had knelt beside him and he had lowered his head onto her lap as if he had been waiting for her for a very long time. But this time was different. This time there was no iron trap, no darkness, no growling, only afternoon, golden light, and the healed dog lying beside the woman who had chosen to stay. Sterling sat on the other side of Brick, his shoulder almost touching Josie's. His left shoulder was still a little stiff when he turned, but he sat comfortably, his back resting against the stone pillar, his legs stretched out on the step. His phone was in his pocket, silent. He didn't take it out. No one said anything for a while. It was the kind of silence that was complete on its own, lacking nothing, needing nothing. The silence of 2 people who had stopped keeping distance, without having to announce when they had stopped. Brick won't leave me anymore, Josie said. He decided before I did, Sterling said. Josie looked over at him. And you? Sterling looked at her. Gray eyes, fully open, with no layer behind them. Nothing held back, nothing calculated. The eyes of a man who had kept his fist clenched for a very long time and had finally, slowly, opened it. The last time I trusted someone, he said. I lost her. He stopped, not because Delia's name was heavy, though it still was. He stopped because the next sentence was lighter than anything he had said in 4 years. and he needed a moment to get used to the feeling of lightness. This time, I don't trust. He looked at her. I know. Josie didn't answer with words. She leaned her shoulder against his, lightly, just enough for both of them to feel it. He didn't move away. Brick breathed evenly between them, deep and slow, the breathing of an animal that had found its place and had no intention of going anywhere again. Josie thought about the past 10 days. The night she stopped her car in Dock Ward because she heard a cry. The dark warehouse. The dog collapsed on the cold concrete. The trap. The 3 black SUVs, and the man who walked in alone and asked, "What do you need?" The oak kitchen table that had held 2 surgeries. The night Brick burned with fever, 2 people sitting on the kitchen floor at 2 o'clock in the morning, listening to the clock ticking. The name Delia spoken aloud for the first time. The brown envelope. The phone call before dawn. The old leather bag placed on the stone table beside the mansion door. 10 days. She hadn't known 10 days could hold that much. Sometimes healing doesn't come from searching. No one plans for it. No one schedules an appointment. No one writes in a notebook that, next Tuesday, healing begins. It comes from the night you stop your car, because you hear someone's pain, not because you were asked, not because you were paid, but because you can't keep driving when you know that behind that warehouse door, a living creature needs you. And sometimes, the one who needs healing most isn't the wounded animal. It is the person standing there watching, fist clenched, holding everything together by sheer will, waiting for someone brave enough to step into the darkness first so he has a reason to open his hand. Sterling didn't look for Josie. Josie didn't look for Sterling. She looked for a dog in pain, and the dog led her to a man who needed the one thing he would never ask for on his own, the chance to let go. Evening mist began to settle lightly over the steps. Brick yawned, long and lazy, the kind of yawn made by a dog who no longer had a worry in the world. Josie placed her hand on his head. Sterling sat beside her, his shoulder touching hers, and in the small garden behind the gray stone mansion at the end of Dock Ward, where no one was allowed to enter without permission, a woman had walked in, without asking permission, and stayed. Life sometimes teaches us lessons in ways no book can ever write down. That kindness doesn't need a reason. That trust isn't something we give once and lose forever, but something we choose to give again when we are strong enough to endure both possible outcomes. That sometimes the person who heals you is also the person who needs healing, and 2 wounds placed side by side don't double the pain, they divide it. If this story touched your heart, please press the like button so more people can hear it. Share it with someone you think needs to believe that healing can still find us from the most unexpected place. How did this story make you feel? Please leave a comment and share what is deep in your heart. We always listen to every line of your comments. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next stories every day. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every single day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.